Get ready for some seriously controversial British sitcoms. We're about to dive into the two shows that caused the biggest uproar. You might remember that I've talked about other shows that were pretty controversial, but those usually got cancelled after just one episode aired. These two shows, though, actually made it onto TV for a while. One even ran for years. I picked these two because they're basically connected at the hip. The same person wrote them, and they both contain offensive humour. Both shows were slammed by critics and the public, but unfortunately some people actually admired the characters and their awful views. One show relied on its main character performing long, angry rants, while the other used a ton of racial slurs and even had a character in blackface. It's pretty shocking stuff. The two shows are Till Death Us Do Part and Curry and Chips. Very likely you will have heard of Till Death Us Do Part and its two sequel series that between them were originally broadcast by the BBC and ITV between 1965 and 1992. Curry and Chips might not be so familiar. It lasted for just one series of 6 episodes in 1969, made by London Weekend Television for the ITV network. Till Death Us Do Part started out as a 1965 BBC comedy playhouse pilot written by Johnny Speight about the Ramsey family. The BBC then asked Speight to write a series of Till Death Us Do Part, so, with a few changes, a series began, featuring a typical sitcom family, husband and wife Alf and Else Garnett, their grown-up daughter Rita, and her husband Mike. However, this is not some cosy My Family precursor. Alf is a racist, working-class conservative, constantly at odds with his socialist layabout son-in-law, while daughter Rita tries to moderate their quarrels with varying degrees of success. Alf's wife sits in the background, saying very little, but occasionally what she does say puts Alf in his place. The first series caused outcry over the frequent use of what is now considered mild swearing, and Alf's extreme views on religion, politics and immigration. Alf spouted contemporary pejorative terms for non-white immigrants that Speight claims were included to highlight and satirise the ignorance of people like Alf in their blanket bigotry against foreign settlers. In theory, the counterpoint was presented by Mike, criticising Alf's bigotry and ignorance while proposing his own biased views on religion, politics, the establishment. This type of invective-ridden dialogue was not uncommon in the kitchen sink dramas of the period, but it had rarely crossed over into the cosy world of sitcom. So it is understandable that not only did the show come in for criticism for the swearing and racist views, but it also fueled support for people who genuinely shared Alf's opinions. Despite this, the BBC commissioned a second series, attracting an estimated 19 million viewers, making it one of their 10 most watched programmes. By the third season in 1968, Till Death Us Do Part was at the top of the television ratings. The popularity of the show resulted in a paperback book adapted from some of the television storylines by John Burke, and a book of selected scripts was also published. Pye Records issued 2 LPs and an EP of soundtrack segments. Warren Mitchell even toured clubs in the guise of his loudmouth alter ego. There were also films in 1968 and 1972, the first of which traced the wartime experiences of Alf and Else before the present-day era of the series. Curry and Chips had a very different origin and was presented in a slightly surreal sitcom style. Though attracting a smaller audience than Till Death Us Do Part, around 13 to 15 million viewers, Curry and Chips attracted just as much controversy. It was set on the shop floor of toy manufacturer Lillicrap Limited and was also written by Johnny Speight. It was apparently based on an idea by Spike Milligan, who, among other things, co-wrote and starred in BBC radio series The Goon Show. Curry and Chips was one of the first shows made by recently formed London Weekend Television, and their first show made entirely in colour. The first episode aired on ITV in November 1969. The date will become more relevant later. The characters were the staff of the toy company, including the liberal factory foreman, Eric Sykes, an overt racist shop steward, Norman Rossington, a black worker, Kenny Lynch, and an Irish Pakistani, Kevin O'Grady, played by Spike Milligan. While Milligan was born in India and lived there until aged about 15, his mother was English and his father was Irish, so although Spike was Indian by birth, he was white. This apparently necessitated him to appear in obvious blackface makeup, and he adopted a mock pidgin accent, complete with nodding head. It's difficult to imagine any other characterisation with so many dubious attributes. Not content with Spike's racially offensive character, the script was filled with provocative, pejorative terms for non-white, non-British individuals. Even the character Kenny, played by British-born actor Kenny Lynch, whose mother was Caribbean Irish and whose father was a Barbadian, verbally berated Milligan's character for being a foreigner. It was claimed that Spate and Milligan were satirising the issues of the native working class attitudes to immigration, using stereotypes to promote empathy for the migrants and undermine the beliefs represented by native xenophobes. But Curry and Chips lacked even a suggestion of social commentary. Johnny Spate defended the script, saying the characters used what he called realistic factory language. Despite gaining popularity with viewers for displaying these attitudes towards race and immigration, this seemed to reinforce rather than reform the prejudiced attitudes of the audience. The appearance of British performers in blackface dates back to the Victorian era. The British blackface minstrels were not a diligent reproduction of black cultural practice, but caricatures based on white conceptions of Africans and African Americans. Along with other forms of Victorian popular culture, such as adventure fiction, travel writing and advertising, the cultural misappropriation of minstrels reinforced the racial superiority of white people over black people. More recent depictions were common in BBC radio broadcasts, with the Kentucky Minstrels first broadcast in January 1933. They remained a staple of BBC radio until December 1950, when they continued to make occasional appearances as guests on other shows. Then, from 1957 to 1978, BBC Television broadcast the Black and White Minstrel Show, a variety programme with blackface performers. In 1968, the BBC experimented with a pilot show called Masquerade, in which the singers appeared without blackface. The performers wore half face masks. Audiences said the singers lacked expression without the makeup. A year later, the Black and White Minstrel Show returned. The BBC finally axed the programme in response to a heightened sense of awareness of its racist associations, yet many viewers still clamoured for its return. While the Black and White Minstrel Show was considerably less racist than its Victorian predecessors, its links with earlier forms of blackface caricature were undeniable, and in any case, influential sectors of public opinion were turning against its whole concept as an entertainment form. Milligan's blackface appearance in Curry and Chips coincided with the heydays of the Black and White Minstrel Show, but even at that time it was considered out of place in a situation comedy. If the 50s were in black and white, then the 60s were in Technicolor. The pop culture, sexual attitudes and the progressive new Labour government of Britain's swinging 60s meant that conflict between the age groups was inevitable. The ultra-conservative Alf Garnett and his trendy left-wing son-in-law engaged in heated debates about everything from religion to politics, with the post-war influx of immigrants a topic of repeated interest. Within the context of the news and documentary themes of the time, Alf's attitudes towards race inevitably appeared logical, if extreme, for many people and validated their own racist opinions. It soon became clear that a part of the audience was laughing along to Alf's rants about blacks, immigrants and the welfare state. Rather than being a figure of fun, he was increasingly being seen as a voice of reason. Both Spate and Milligan defended the show against allegations of racism, claiming that their intention was to belittle Alf's views. They claimed that the satire was lost on the part of the audience the show aimed to challenge. However, the viewing public were not particularly used to satire in situation comedy. Satire is understood in a short routine as part of a sketch show, allowing for sharper, more focused commentary. The audience understand that the sketch is aiming at a specific target or social issue. In Curry and Chips, Spike's character Kevin is a product of the British Empire, proud of his Irish father because it is how he has been brought up to behave by an empire-minded education. He finds it absurd that his co-workers don't understand that. This is in line with Spike's real upbringing in British India, having been born in a racist society and spent the first 15 years of his life being taught that he was superior because he was white. The concept of racial difference from the Empire times made a lasting impression on racism in the post-war period, and consequently most British white people saw no reason to revise attitudes held since colonial days. Curry and Chips illustrated the standard tone of racial humour that was emerging at the time. It set up a multicultural scenario as the basis for racial tension. The usual construct featured a racist proponent who was blatantly narrow-minded. In general, this would be counterpoised by a black character who would highlight the racist mindset and put them right, or alternatively, a white liberal who would urge a more empathetic approach towards black people. Whilst it was also lambasted, a similar principle was used in ITV's Love Thy Neighbour. Whatever white Eddie Booth had to say, it was usually intelligently countered by his black neighbour Bill Reynolds. Till Death Us Do Part and Curry and Chips were both characterised by critical audiences as vulgar. Their accusations of vulgarity against Till Death Us Do Part by its contemporary audience is revealed in documents from the BBC archives. Newspaper columnists also described it as vulgar. A large-scale viewer report into the programme in 1973 found that 50% of viewers and 79% of non-viewers considered Till Death Us Do Part to be vulgar. However, the absence of any regular black character in Till Death Us Do Part was arguably more relevant grounds for criticism, because Alf was referring to black people in a derogatory way when they had no significant right of reply in the programme, or on British television at large. At the time, because of television's overriding social whiteness, even in black-related debates, this did not seem particularly exceptional. Vulgarity was also included in the criticism of Curry and Chips' use of bad language. 5 out of 6 calls received by Granada Television about the Curry and Chips Boxing Day episode objected to the vulgarity. The Independent Television Authority, the regulator for ITV broadcasting, was conscious of the bad language used in the programme. Even Bernard Sandel, an ITA executive, characterised it as unnecessarily vulgar. In internal memos, their own staff considered some of the bluer parts of the dialogue are not in the best taste at any time, and that the constant repetition of meaningless swearing is neither justified by the characters or the script. Despite this, the ITA did not intervene. In public, the BBC and ITA remain resolute in their belief that both Till Death Us Do Part and Curry and Chips were satirical and thereby positive text for race relations. Both organisations were similarly unresponsive to claims that racial content in comedy and light entertainment in the 1960s and 1970s could be problematic or offensive. The ITA, in its generic response to letters of complaint about Curry and Chips, explained that the programme aimed to expose to ridicule all the misconceived prejudice to which people can be prone in this area. A viewer wrote to the ITA to complain that Milligan's performance was horrifyingly racist and asked why it did not constitute a violation of the Race Relations Act. The union leader Clive Jenkins wrote a much publicised letter to the Race Relations Board to complain that Spike Milligan, who played Kevin, ensured the character emerged as a figure of ridicule who constantly seeks to ape British manners while also denying his ethnic origin, and that Curry and Chips more broadly takes a serious theme and then sensationalises and degrades it. The Race Relations Board, however, told the Daily Mail, "Whatever Spike Milligan does on the show, I can't see the board getting involved." In their first annual report, the Race Relations Board noted that 70% of complaints they received fell outside of the scope of the Act. they had no power to intervene over the content of television broadcasts. Meanwhile, in the town of Madley in Shropshire, an art teacher, Mary Whitehouse, was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with what she saw on television. She wrote to the BBC requesting to see the BBC's Director General. He was out of the country, but she was offered an opportunity to meet his deputy. It was following this meeting that she felt went very well that she became the self-appointed arbiter of taste and decency on television. Along with the wife of a local vicar, she launched the Clean Up TV campaign in January 1964 with a manifesto appealing to the women of Britain. The campaign's first public meeting on the 5th of May 1964 in Birmingham Town Hall attracted 2,000 people to hear her speak. The Times newspaper commented, "Perhaps never before in the history of Birmingham Town Hall has such a successful meeting been sponsored by such a flimsy organisation." She was not going to get all her own way. BBC Director General Hugh Green did not share her opinions. In a speech in 1965, he argued that the critics of his more liberal approach to broadcasting would attack whatever does not underwrite a set of prior assumptions, and saw the potential for a dangerous form of censorship which works by causing artists and writers not to take risks. He defended the right of the BBC to be ahead of public opinion. Green ignored Whitehouse and blocked her from participating in BBC broadcasts. Whitehouse carried on unabated and became founder and first president of the National Viewers and Listeners Association, through which she led a long-standing campaign against the BBC. Specifically, she campaigned against Spate and Till Death Us Do Part. She was opposed to liberal permissiveness, and as such her crusade targeted sex, violence and swearing. However, her religious upbringing did not extend to challenging anti-gay rhetoric, as she was wildly homophobic, according to Lucy Mangan, writing in The Guardian in 2022. Philosopher of morality Mary Warnock wrote that Whitehouse was furious with Johnny Spate for his character Alf Garnett, because she believed such foul language and such blatant prejudice ought not to be represented on the screen. Warnock considered Whitehouse stupid for not recognising that satire, if it is to succeed, must accurately represent its targets so that they are recognisable. Throughout the 1960s, Whitehouse complained to the Prime Minister about how dirty, blasphemous and full of bad language the programmes were. She claimed that it was quite ludicrous to interpret the large audiences Till Death Us Do Part was attracting as indicating approval of the programme. After all, there's nothing like a commotion for drawing a crowd. Indeed, the commotion she was making drew a crowd, but it fell on deaf ears at the BBC. However, Spate was not going to let her dictate what he should write, so he used an appearance on BBC Radio's flagship news programme, The World at One, in 1967 to launch a verbal assault on Whitehouse that one could infer that Mrs Whitehouse and her association were fascists. Whitehouse successfully sued the BBC and Johnny Spate for libel in July 1967, receiving a full apology and substantial damages. However, Spate would have the last laugh. He wrote an episode of Till Death Us Do Part titled Alf's Dilemma, also known as Cleaning Up TV, in which Alf is shown to be enthusiastically reading Whitehouse's book Cleaning Up TV. He defends Whitehouse to Mike, saying that woman is concerned with the moral welfare of your country, isn't she? The moral fibre that's been rotted away by your corrupt television. Alf's satirical support of Whitehouse was damning and placing her beliefs in line with the right-wing character she abhorred. But Spate was not finished there. Believing that Alf had caught some infection from handling the book, it was thrown on the fire and burnt. By the mid-1960s, Britain had become the country with the largest overseas population of West Indians. The West Indian population was scattered widely across the country, predominantly in London, Manchester and Birmingham. On the 20th of April 1968, the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, Enoch Powell, made what became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. In his discourse to a meeting of the Conservative Political Centre in Birmingham, Powell strongly criticised the rates of immigration from the new Commonwealth, mostly former colonies of the British Empire, to the United Kingdom since the Second World War. He also opposed the Race Relations Bill, which, when it was passed into law, criminalised the refusal of housing, employment or public services to persons on the grounds of colour, race or ethnic or national origin. Ted Heath, the leader of the Conservative Party at the time, dismissed Powell from the Shadow Cabinet the day after the speech. The speech caused national controversy and made Powell one of the most talked about and divisive politicians in Britain. According to most accounts, the popularity of Powell's views on immigration might have been a decisive factor in the Conservative Party's unexpected victory at the 1970 general election. In her book Representing Black Britain, Sir Rita Malik has suggested that Spate was inspired to write Curry and Chips after the fever-pitch response to Powell's 1968 Rivers of Blood speech. This is entirely possible as Curry and Chips was broadcast a year after the speech, and the show has regular references to Powell throughout the episodes. Furthermore, the sitcom was set in a West Midlands factory where Powell's constituency was, and according to Fred Lindop, author of Racism and the Working Class Strikes in Support of Enoch Powell in 1968, it was one of the principal areas affected by recent immigration and where the majority of strikes in support of Powell occurred. So, whilst Enoch Powell was having a major impact on opening up the public debate about race and immigration in the political and legislative arena, the staff of Lillicrap Limited and Alf Garnett were stirring it up in people's living rooms. Audiences, as well as being hugely unpredictable, are not just motivated by good intentions or implied meanings. Despite any genuine intention by Spate to ridicule racism, he had no control over the audience seeing Alf Garnett as a victim or a hero of the comedy. In what might nowadays be called damage control strategy, Spate proclaimed himself not a reformer, but a comic writer who wanted to make people laugh. He claimed that his comedy was intended to make people laugh at really important real-life subjects, to possibly help them face up to their own stupidity or ignorance or prejudice. He defended Curry and Chips on the grounds that there is a message in this series: prejudice is laughable. Those statements, however, did not agree with comments he made that exposed his apprehension about immigration. In an interview with Barry Norman in the Daily Mail on the 21st of October 1969, Spate expressed concerns about a shortage of work and his dismay that if our own people can't get council houses, there's bound to be resentment of immigrants getting them. These sentiments, he concluded, produces people like the shop steward Norman in Curry and Chips. Spate's autobiographies highlight his contradictory approach to the question of race and immigration. He described visiting Canning Town in 1973 to find locations for the film version of Till Death Us Do Part. He visited a home where he commented, 5 families that were living then, perhaps a whole tribe. Spate's use of the word tribe may have been meant to be humorous, but could be perceived as suggesting they were uncivilised or primitive. He described Moss Side in Manchester as a coloured ghetto where coloured cats spent small fortunes on their woolly heads. Like Spate, Milligan was similarly concerned that immigration would result in the dilution of the native white population's culture. According to Milligan's former agent and close friend, Norma Farnes, throughout the 1960s, Milligan was seriously concerned about the wave of immigrants from India and Pakistan. He could and did go on about it for hours. If illegal immigrants went unchecked, he argued, one day in the future England would become a melting pot, its native culture submerged until it became so diluted it would disappear forever. Perhaps then it should be no surprise that in 1975 Milligan wrote and starred in a BBC comedy playhouse sitcom pilot titled The Melting Pot. Milligan, again, appeared in blackface. Attitudes of this sort were exhibited in both Till Death Us Do Part and Curry and Chips, where working class characters were shown to hark back to themes of empire in their descriptions of the immigrant community. Spate's exploration of cultural integration evidently extended to the choice of local actors too. Kenny Lynch was acceptable because, although black, having been brought up in Stepney, he was culturally similar to Spate. Lynch was an English singer, songwriter and entertainer. He appeared in many variety shows in the 1960s when he was among the few black singers in British pop music. The Actors Union Equity complained about the lack of racial diversity on television. London Weekend Television maintained that there were few coloured performers who can be funny in the way that appeals to British audiences. They argued that there is only one Kenny Lynch. Currently, television broadcast standards are regulated by Ofcom. Until the 12th of January 1972, ITV broadcasts were regulated by the Independent Television Authority. BBC standards were the responsibility of channel and programme controllers. The BBC and ITA archives reveal that Spate could be difficult to work with, as he frequently leaked stories to the press if he did not get his own way, in order to force his employers into submission. Spate disagreed with the BBC's decision to air the episode of Till Death Us Do Part Telephone before the episode Monopoly. Michael Mills, head of comedy at the BBC, wrote to forewarn colleagues that something of a dust-up is about to break with regard to the new series. Mr. Johnny Spate has been shouting the odds over the telephone to me. I understand he intends to protest about this. Knowing his propensity for issuing stories to the newspapers, making himself out to be martyred by the BBC, I imagine it will be along such lines. On the 19th of November 1969, a senior programme officer at the Independent Television Authority wrote to his colleagues to express his concern that the sitcom Curry and Chips was simply a revelation of Johnny Spate's deep-seated prejudices. In advance of the programme's first broadcast, the ITA was concerned about the central character being performed by a white comic and suggested Spike Milligan be replaced by a Pakistani actor. Spate had no intention of making any such change. It seems that Spate and Milligan had a degree of creative and editorial control over Curry and Chips beyond the scope simply of writers and actor. The ITA struggled to maintain editorial control over the final broadcast episodes. A memo indicated a series of objectionable passages in the episode 27th November 1969 that were ad-libs. The senior programmes officer at ITA wrote to all regional officers to notify them of cuts to an episode of Curry and Chips which Spate had not yet been made aware of. This was a precaution due to Spate's reputation for leaking stories to the press. Despite attempting to placate hostility towards the programme by shifting the series to a post-Watershed time slot and cancelling its broadcast in Ulster, the ITA finally decided the series would be cancelled after its final episode on Boxing Day 1969. In letters rationalising the reasons for the series cancellation, ITA executive Bernard Sandell suggested that bad language was the key issue. He complained that episode 5 was not fit for transmission at any time in the form in which we saw it. Once again, this had obviously nothing to do with race, but simply with language and dirt. Curry and Chips was vulgar because of its persistent use of bad language. A subsequent survey found that, contrary to Spike and Milligan's claimed desire for the series to improve race relations in the UK, 88% of viewers found the programme's portrayal of coloured people to not be objectionable at all, and 83% of viewers' attitudes towards coloured people remained apathetic and unchanged. In 1973, the BBC commissioned a survey of more than 700 people, regular and occasional viewers, and people who had never seen Till Death Us Do Part. Many viewers found the show hilarious, but BBC chiefs were shocked when research revealed that a significant proportion of Alf's 16 million fans also thought his views were quite reasonable. The report concluded that the survey supported the idea that the series may have reinforced existing illiberal and anti-trade union attitudes. BBC bosses thought the review undermined claims that the show was a satire. At a meeting on the 18th of July 1973, BBC Director General Sir Charles Curran said the report had diminished his confidence that it was possible to make anti-prejudicial comedy. The BBC decided not to publish the report because it considered the unscientific nature of the research might expose it to criticism in academic circles. Till Death Us Do Part and its successors Till Death, made by Associated Television for ITV, and In Sickness and in Health, carried on, while the only character remaining throughout was Alf. In later series, his racist tirades were moderated with the introduction of Winston, a flamboyant black gay council carer, in 18 of the 47 episodes. Eventually, Alf becomes more tolerant of Winston, despite his prejudices. To compound the offence, Spike Milligan's Kevin O'Grady character then appeared in episodes of Till Death Us Do Part in 1970 and again in 1974. Finally, in 1988, Spate was warned about the use of racist language. It was decided that Alf's racist language was to be discontinued and the character of Winston, Alf's black gay home help, was to be written out, with such improvements helping to update the basic concept. In Sickness and in Health ran until 1992. A comedy playhouse pilot of The Melting Pot, starring Milligan as a Pakistani, was shown in June 1975. The BBC refused to show subsequent series due to be broadcast in August 1976. The popular consensus seems to be that the BBC disliked the racially insensitive nature of the series as a whole. Milligan played yet another Pakistani character in The Jewel in the Crown, South or Middlesex, also written by Spate, for which a pilot was made in 1985. It was not broadcast by the BBC, but it did appear on YouTube for a few months in 2019. So little is known about it, I couldn't realistically include it in this video series, but from what I have read, it would have fitted right in with the other Spate-Milligan blackface disgraces. Despite all of the foregoing, both Spate and Milligan continue to be given work by the BBC and ITV companies. It remains one of the most embarrassing chapters of British television, made worse by its creators' claim they were doing good. Well, there you have it, a look back at the UK's two most controversial sitcoms ever broadcast. Till Death Us Do Part and Curry and Chips certainly pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable on television at the time, and they continue to spark debate today. It's important to remember the cultural context of these shows and to recognise that attitudes towards race and ethnicity have changed significantly over the years. While these sitcoms may not age well, they offer a fascinating glimpse into the past and a reminder of how far we've come. Let me know your thoughts on these controversial comedies in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nostalgic television content. Thanks for watching.